Welcome to another edition of Unstoppable Mindset. I'm your host, Michael Hingson, and we get to talk today with Donald Wood, who is in Taos, New Mexico, originally from Arkansas, so you won't hear a New Mexico accent from Donald. He has been involved in change management. He's formed companies, and I don't want to give a lot away because it's kind of more fun to ask him. So I'm just going to say, Donald, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
Well, thank you, Michael. I am honored to be here.
And hopefully we won't see a lot of snow come down in Taos or here while we're talking. At least we can hope.
I won't complain. I'm very fortunate to be in the warmth of my home office right now. So I'm not going to complain because, I'm sure like in California, here in New Mexico, we could use the precipitation.
We can, but it is also, for me, good to be in the warmth of home office. So that's great. Well, let's start, if we could, by just kind of going back. Tell me a little bit about you growing up and just kind of your background and all that. And let's go from there.
Sure, absolutely. Background is that I was born and raised in Arkansas and grew up in a family that was very much involved in, kind of community work. And so, but also very involved in the arts. I have two sisters who not only danced all the way into college scholarships, but also danced professionally a bit. And a mom who, although she would admit, cannot keep a beat and dance to save her life, but started three different nonprofit ballet companies and ran one of them for 25 years, really because she just wanted to provide not only her daughters, but provide every single young person who wanted the opportunity to experience dance, that opportunity. So she had lived in a couple different communities that did not have nonprofit ballet schools or companies. And just from her own experience on the sheer cost of trying to have a child commit to dancing and how expensive it was, realized that there was a void for that in a couple different communities she lived in Arkansas. And so my mom ran a nonprofit, was very involved in the nonprofit arts community, had a dad who was on the other end, a corporate CFO, and but in his spare time, with really no one but maybe a few people knew, he would do nonprofit financials for a few different nonprofits. He would do people's taxes or 990s for them for free. And so I was very fortunate, almost through osmosis, because I don't remember sitting around the kitchen table talking about servant leadership or nonprofit work, but just saw that in how my parents were, and was like a lot of probably young people, and I'm assuming even in this generation, but I think I'm generation X, I think, XY, somewhere around there. Didn't have any idea what I wanted to do in life, but I played sports and danced growing up, but what really focused on sports towards the later time of and wanted to play a college sport. So I went to a small college to play football, and not knowing what I wanted to do after that, and being, I think, a typical young person and not really thinking much past what I'm going to do in a few hours or tomorrow. Didn't think about that till towards the end of my college career. But I did know that I wanted to work at some level in service. I didn't know if that was nonprofit or in the public sector. I also really enjoyed group work, group dynamics, collaborations, public speaking, interpersonal communications. And so that at least gave me some idea of what I wanted to do. And so after college, I moved overseas, and I knew I also loved to travel. So, and in college, playing a sport, and I was very involved. I was president of student government and president of a fraternity. And so I didn't really have the opportunity to study abroad. And so I wanted to live overseas, moved to Southeast Asia, lived there for about 9 months or so. Was going to live there longer, but 9/11 happened while I was there. And so I decided to come back to the United States and wanted to even more than ever serve others, serve my country in some form or fashion, and felt that was in public service. So I went back and got my master's degree the University of Arkansas and with a focus in civic engagement, but my master's was in the communications department, but with a focus on civic engagement. And the idea there was I was wanted to work in foreign diplomacy, maybe for the State Department, and was on my way applying for that, and had full intention to figure out a way to make that work as a career, and a person who would later become a mentor, and then one of my dearest friends who happened to be the vice chancellor of advancement at the University of Arkansas, which, is over all the fundraising and marketing and public relations. He happened to be a graduate of the tiny little liberal arts college that I went to, and reached out to me and took me for lunch and told me all about the wonderful world of advancement fundraising, which I know most kids don't grow up thinking I want to be a professional fundraiser. And I was the same. I had done a little bit of fundraising as an AmeriCorps fellow, calling people on the phone. I had seen my mom run tennis tournament to raise money for the ballet. So that's what I thought fundraising was. And my mentor, his name is Dave Gearhart. He went on to be the chancellor at the University of Arkansas. But Dave just painted the picture of what I think really is, and how he painted it as a noble profession, and one that was absolutely necessary in addressing some of the world's most complex, complicated issues, and that being a successful philanthropist, fundraiser. So I got into that professionally, and absolutely loved it. I still am, I would say, a nonprofit development or fundraising nerd. But I was in the primarily nonprofit development business for the first probably 10 to 12 years of my career, with the last gig overseeing a foundation for one of the country's largest nonprofit hospice and palliative care organizations. And then moved into what really was the dream job opportunity for me, and the stars aligned, plus the fact that being very privileged in who I am and how I was born. I was very fortunate. The stars aligned, as they say, and was given the opportunity to be the CEO of a diversity, equity, and inclusion education nonprofit organization. And that really kind of shifted my career into full-time change management, with an emphasis on pursuing and advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ran that nonprofit for 5 years. And then was able to, again, fortune raised its wonderful head and gave me the opportunity to move into full-time consulting around change management. And that's where I find myself today.
Gee, lots of questions. So out of curiosity, why Southeast Asia did you travel to initially?
Yeah, great question. All I knew for sure going into my senior year of college was that I was going to live overseas somewhere. I had very little money. I was bartending and substitute teaching, and I knew I was going to save up some money. So I wanted to try to find a place where my money would go the furthest, and I'd have a really tremendously uncomfortable, in the best sense, experience, meaning being in a culture that was very unlike mine. So I had two obvious options. One was Germany, where I had a good friend that played football with me, who graduated the year before, was playing in the German football league. And I had an apartment there, and he said I could crash on his couch and basically have a place to live for 6 or so months. And then my sister and brother-in-law, fortunately for me, my brother-in-law worked for 3M, the manufacturing company, and he was an engineer, and had been transferred to Singapore. And although I wasn't really close at the time with my sister, she was quite a bit older than me. We had a very good relationship, but just wasn't really close. I reached out and just asked if I could come live with them for a month or so, try to find work. And if not, I would maybe live there another couple months and then come back. And they were very generous and welcoming me. And so I thought Singapore to me sounded much more interesting and challenging and life altering than somewhere in Europe. And so, yeah, that is why I went to Singapore.
And I gather enjoyed it until, as you said, September 11th happened.
Yeah, absolutely. loved it. And I was very fortunate. It took me about 3 months, but I got a job working with youth at an organization that worked with youth from all different types of cultures and countries, and was an activity coordinator, and ended up running a summer camp, and was sort of debating around August, actually, July of August of 2020, or 2001, whether or not to really commit, because I was offered a new job within the organization, which or going back to the States. So they were gonna give me to the end of the calendar year to continue my current job and think about it, because the person I would be replacing was going to leave at the beginning of 2002. And then 9/11 happened, and a week later, on September 18th, I flew home to the United States. Yep.
About the time the airplane started flying again.
Oh yeah, it was eerie. If you've ever had the opportunity to fly on, I can't remember what size it is, jet, but one that, we're talking anywhere between a 15 to a 20-hour flight, depending on which direction. I had the entire middle row, I remember, to myself, which was nice because I could lay down and sleep, but it was really eerie. And then I remember my first U.S. airport to fly in was Minneapolis, which is a huge airport, and it was just empty except our flight. And it was just very strange because, I had flown just a few months before, and, that was back when people could literally, your friends or family who were seeing you off could walk right up to the gate, and it was quite bustling in an airport. And it was just absolutely empty. So yeah, it was very, it was very interesting times.
I remember the first time after September 11th I flew, it was somewhere around the 5th or 6th of October.
Wow.
And I was invited to go speak in British Columbia. We went to the airport in Newark, New Jersey, to Liberty Airport. And yeah, again, it was a pretty empty airport.
Yeah.
But as my wife put it, because she was traveling with, she said, it's really scary to see these 18-year-old National Guard kids with submachine guns patrolling the airport. And we even had a situation where someone near us or came near us had a backpack, put the backpack down, and then left.
Wow.
And of course, we didn't know what was going on and sat there for a while. And Karen was about to go find someone to report it when he came back. So he must have gone to a restroom or whatever, but he left his backpack, which was a very eerie feeling.
Absolutely. So, that triggered a memory. I do remember now the guards with machine guns in the airport. Yeah.
Yeah. The youngsters, no less. I mean, they weren't old, very mature people, but it was okay. And we flew, and it was a not full plane. So it was a very strange experience. And it's one of those things that we definitely needed to do. So that started a speaking career for me, and it's been fun ever since. So I can't complain, but I do appreciate having been in the World Trade Center on September 11th, that all the challenges, and I understand all the things that have been happening since. I think we've collectively not always made great choices in some of the things that we do, but that's something where there's obviously growth opportunities to deal with.
Right. Yeah, I can't even fathom the experience that you had there. That's amazing.
Well, so you did some work in the whole issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
What are the differences between those three things?
Yeah, that's a great question that I didn't realize needed to be asked until I became a full-time professional or consultant around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it dawned on me when I was working with organizations that they were looking for answers around different issues that, there were maybe overlap, but some had to do with diversity, some had to do with inclusion, some had to do with equity. And because they weren't on the same page around those definitions, some had different definitions for the same concept. Some had, the right definition for one concept, but kind of superimposed it on another. And then what happened is that would lead to solutions or strategies where folks weren't on the same page with what the end goal was, which was, again, either diversity, inclusion, or equity. Because, diversity, we're talking about representation. It's a matter of kind of the composition of a group and an organization. When you're thinking about inclusion, you're talking about really, it's really a feeling. It's a matter of behavior and how people feel in terms of belonging or feeling welcome. And then equity is really a matter of structure and access, how things are designed, put together, adapted in order for people to have equal opportunities at accessing those resources. So representation, diversity, sense of belonging, inclusion, and access with equity. And, a lot of diversity initiatives fail and have failed. Diversity became such a hot, corporate change buzzword or pursuit in the 80s and in the 90s. But a lot have failed if you really break down kind of measuring, because folks really just focused on the representation part, the composition part. And a lot of times there would be the token person that was not white or not a cis male, and they feel like, clap the hands, check the box, work done here, we're diverse. And to some extent, they were more diverse than they were, but they weren't diverse in terms of representing the communities that they lived and operated in, or representing the communities of people that they served. And then, in the 2000s, but particularly after the summer of 2020, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, inclusion and equity started to become popular buzzwords and buzz concepts. But what was happening is people were still thinking kind of diversity, and especially folks that were not as nearly in tune to what inclusion and equity were. They were like, yeah, let's keep doing diversity. And people in leadership are saying that, whereas community members or employees were thinking, no, we want inclusion. We want to feel like our voices matter, that we belong. We want equity. We want equal access to resources within the organization. But because there was this disconnect on those definitions, the executives were saying, yeah, we're doing diversity. And they were just thinking representation. And but they were saying DEI almost became one word in and of itself, DEI. Mm-hmm. Or people would say diversity, equity, inclusion, when all they really were doing was just kind of the diversity part. And it was really disheartening for a lot of folks who were really wanted inclusion and equity. And I saw this so many times when I would consult with an organization who'd maybe already done some work or had past work around DEI. And really, if you looked at their diversity statements or you looked at their diversity initiatives, it was really just diversity, but they called it diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's really all that because they really didn't understand, I think, the difference and the fact that it required different strategies and solutions in order to achieve all three. And also, Michael, diversity does not beget inclusion or equity. A lot of folks, think they have that whole, what is the Kevin Costner movie, the Field of Dreams mentality. If you build, they will come. So even to this day, a lot of folks feel if we increase diversity, inclusion and equity will follow. And that's not the case at all. Actually, it can be much more detrimental, especially it could be even seriously traumatic and dangerous for people that come from marginalized groups to be that token person that comes in to an organization, and they don't have a support group of people that have a shared lived experience than they do. It can provide support. You see a lot of women in leadership roles, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who come in without any sort of support, even formal mentoring or informal support. And they really, really struggle, and they're blamed. There's like, look, we tried. We hired a chief DEI officer. We tried, didn't work. But they don't realize that inclusion equity part wasn't really in place or focused on. It was just that diversity part. And they think, well, we checked the box, we did it, didn't work. Bottom line wasn't affected. Let's move on. And so, yeah, that's why I think it's incredibly important that any organization that wants to pursue diversity, equity, inclusion really first understand the difference between the three.
I wholeheartedly agree and support that. I would observe that with diversity, for example, and we've talked about it on this podcast a number of times, the problem with diversity is it doesn't involve disabilities. If you
Right.
talk about diversity, they talk about, as you said, race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, and never discuss disabilities. And people are trying to do the same thing with inclusion. From my perspective, it won't work. You either are inclusive or you're not. You can't be
Right.
partially inclusive. But the problem is we still don't deal with the whole issue of disabilities. And the issue is, I know there's a lot of fear around it.
Yep.
I know there are a lot of misconceptions, but just like we have really changed what diversity is all about, since it doesn't involve disabilities, I think we need to change our view and our definition of the word disability. And that is, disability doesn't mean a lack of ability. What disability is a characteristic. You have a disability. I have a disability. Everyone on this planet has a disability. For most people who don't think they have one, their disability is they're light dependent. And as soon as the lights go out, you're in a world of hurt. And it's just as much a disability and a challenge, because if you don't find the technology that Thomas Edison invented to give you light when the power goes out, like a flashlight or a smartphone or whatever, you're stuck without light, which means you now are facing the disability that you thought was completely covered up.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that triggered something that, as I was preparing actually for the session, I found a quote from Patricia Byrne, or Patty Byrne, who's a disability justice advocate. And she says that disability justice understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know that we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. And so that really kind of struck me as you were speaking, because in being involved full-time professionally in DEI work for the past 8 or so years, you're right, I think, in what you're concluding, that certain systems of oppression, certain injustices like race, around sex and gender, around sexual orientation, tend to come to the forefront when folks are doing work around culture change or change management that involves DEI. But for some reason, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later because you touched on it, the fear aspect, it comes into it. Don't talk about disability justice. And to me, that's so ironic, because I feel, other than, well, actually, perhaps other than any other social justice issue that I've dealt with, the one that most people have some sort of personal experience with, not necessarily relationship or connection to. Like, for example, racism. As a white person, I have a relationship to it, a connection with it, but I don't experience racism.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to disabilities, that's almost the universal issue that folks, like in your example, the Edison example without the light is a great example, because disabilities can be, transient, they can be episodic, they can be something that happens from an injury, that, they can be from a disease, they can be visible, invisible, physical, and even within the disability justice movement, it seems like we sometimes even center mobility impairments and marginalize other forms, and not talk about the emotional or mental or other forms of disability. But it is something, I agree with you, that everyone, almost everyone, and probably at some point, without diminishing folks that have different levels of disabilities in comparison of what the norms are. And I even, be honest with you, even the word disability, I mean, I use that word because that is the predominant word used among people in the disability rights and disability justice movements. But it's still just like racism or sexism, is that there's a norm, which is ability. And so we're classifying all these people that don't match that norm as disability, which I think, I almost wish we could reframe it in a way that it's not that, because that that prefix dis is usually a pejorative or a negative kind of connotation. I've heard different abilities and folks saying, but I've also heard, again, people that are superstars in the disability rights and justice movement use that term disability. So that's the term that I use, but it's all compared to what we consider the norm, which really shouldn't be the norm and people that are quote unquote able-bodied.
Well, and that's why I submit that what we need to do is to plain change the definition of the word. Yeah, people have mentioned the dis part before, but differently abled or any other kind of thing like that is really ducking the truth and is not facing the issue, which is that all of us have characteristics that make us different from other people. And why don't we just call that disability rather than sticking to the old terminology and the old definition? We've done it with diversity. And so we know that we can change the impact and the definition of terminology. So disability is no different, and it doesn't need to keep the connotation that most people have given it if we but think about the reality that we can change it. And that we can recognize that all of us have disabilities. Well, then maybe it isn't really so bad. And that's the problem that we don't seem to be able to get to.
That's a great point. Yeah. Excellent point. Yep.
So, I think that it's really where we need to go. People have said about blind people for years, you're blind or you're visually impaired, which is horrible. And it's like blind or deaf or hearing impaired. People who are deaf hate that concept. It's deaf or hard of hearing, because why do we need to equate how much hearing someone has to quality of life or anything like that? So hearing impaired is a problem. Well, visually impaired is a double problem. One, visually, one doesn't necessarily look different simply because they're blind. And then the impaired part again. So blind and low vision is a much more accurate thing. Although I could make the case that I got lots of vision, I just don't see so good. But, that's okay. I can accept that vision is a terminology that we're going to keep, or a term that we're going to keep. So we could do blind and low vision, but we've got to get beyond this concept that disability is a bad thing because everyone has them. Some people are shorter than others. Some people are taller than others. I have been in vehicles where a tall person gets in and, oh my gosh, I got to bend my knees way up. I can't really fit here. It's uncomfortable. Disability. And why do we not address that? And it gets back to fear, which we've talked about a little bit. How do we deal with overcoming the fears? How do we change people's concepts of what the fears really are? Yeah,
that's another brilliant question. I mean, I mentioned norms. I mean, normalizing it is one thing, and I know that that's extremely challenging. And there's other fears that pile up with that. But I think just normalizing people with disabilities in media, in the workplace, is extremely important. And there's a fine line. I actually, something I didn't share, and talking about my origin story here, is that a life-changing moment. One of the life-changing moments for me was when I was a sophomore in high school and became the teacher's aide for the special education class in my high school. The special ed class is what they called it. Well, the special ed teacher was also the local area Special Olympics volunteer kind of manager. And I got very involved in Special Olympics and became the youngest certified coach in Arkansas for Special Olympic sports. And I was a coach at the World Games in 1996. And it was just a life-changing experience for me. And, even then I really felt like it was almost like disability porn kind of, what is that I needed to kind of wear on my sleeve the fact that I was a Special Olympics coach, and that, and I remember the special education, my classmates, they had their own special class, which I felt was wrong. but at the time being 15, 16, I didn't really know how to address that. But, my classmates who were in the special education class would even have come into the lunch during lunch period kind of separately, almost like they were on parade after all the other the kids who were not in the special education class were sitting down. And I just remember every day after thinking, I don't know why I should do this, but I was doing it. I would get up and I'd go every day, go and visit with my friends and peers that were in the special education class. And again, I wasn't smart enough to realize it at the time, but what I was doing and what I would do more of, I could, is normalize, the fact that yes, these peers of ours, for whatever reason, or for in your standards, my stand, and I say yours and my other classmates' standards, don't look like us or communicate differently than us or learn differently than us. And they were basically, kept away. And that really hit home with me. When I moved to Singapore, one of the things I did too was I wanted to volunteer. And so I immediately reached out, and they had a Special Olympics chapter there. But I'll tell you, Michael, in certain Asian cultures, it's a disgrace to the family to have, and especially, and so I remember, and this is a city state, but I want to say the population was somewhere around 7 or so million. So we're talking something around the size of like a New York City. There was 2 people on staff, and they were utterly shocked that I wanted to volunteer. That the only people that ever volunteered were sometimes family members of, and they had a Special Olympic Games day that was so sad. It was about as good as like maybe a middle school's, field day or special, kind of would be. And I volunteered, and I had I asked my counselors when I was running the summer camp to also volunteer. And I learned a lot that day from volunteering, and ended up volunteering some more and got an accommodation from the president of Singapore and that's so sad. All I did was volunteer for a couple of days, and it was so out of the ordinary because people with disabilities there were literally, figuratively shut out from society. And it was that, just the fear of not what people defined as normal. So I think normalizing is so critically important to addressing the fear issues.
I wrote a book called Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at Ground Zero, that was a New York Times bestseller, and it was published into a variety of languages, including Japanese. And in 2012, I went and spent a few weeks in Japan with the publisher, the Japanese publisher, promoting the book and doing lectures and so on, and meeting various people. One of the things that I learned was that there was legislation, and I don't know if it's changed. There was legislation that blind people in Japan could not sign contracts. And I asked an insurance man about that, because he's the one who told me. And he said, well, but the problem is we're concerned that blind people can be cheated. And I said, look, I have, because it's now 2012, I have technology on my phone that I can use to read and scan print. I have people that I trust, and I recognize that means I'm using the abilities of someone to read, but I have people I trust, right, to read material. In addition to the technology on my phone, there is a device called the Kurzweil reading machine, and that was developed back in the 1970s by someone who created technology that allows people to now read print on their own independently. And here's the real question I asked. I said, so you're telling me that only blind people can get cheated, and that nobody in Japan ever cheats a sighted person in signing a contract?
Yeah.
And of course, he thought about it and he said, well, no, I'm not saying that. And I said, then why is it a problem for blind people? It's a prejudice. Yeah. And I actually used that example in one of my speeches. And there were even Americans in the room. There was a visiting school, and they chastised me later for saying that. How can you say that? Their culture is different. I said, no, it isn't a matter of different culture. It is a matter that we continue to have misconceptions and poor attitudes about how we treat people who are different than we are. And it is so difficult to get people to really understand that it's not the so-called disability or the characteristic that makes me different. It's how we collectively address or treat that difference, because we don't recognize that everybody has differences. Some we just accept and they're normal. Some people are left-handed. We don't regard them as less than we are, but we do regard people who happen to be blind as less than most of us are.
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point. I appreciate you sharing that. And you bring up an interesting point about the argument sometimes for or against things that, or for, let's say, for things that are discriminatory, that it's a cultural difference. And that's something that I early on in my career kind of struggled with, because I had living overseas and traveled overseas, and I realized there were cultural differences. And particularly the organization I ran, we had an imam from a prominent Muslim mosque that was on our board, and the way that some women were treated institutionally, we struggled with. And although he was very progressive and was working towards changing those, at least within the mosque, that was something we battled with earlier. And then in 2019, I was fortunate with a grant through the U.S. State Department and a aid group based out of Canada that operated in Kyiv. I went to Ukraine to do some work around gender equity. And although I had done, I thought, adequate research, I was not prepared for the feedback, pushback I got from meeting with, and they brought me over there to do some training and to do some around a program I'd created called Men as Allies in Arkansas, where I worked with cis male corporate executives in the community to how to be allies for cis and trans women in the workplace. And when I went to Kyiv to do the work, Ukrainian men of a certain generation really pushed back on me, saying that don't bring that U.S. mentality here, that we are actually doing what our women want, that we are, and I remember one gentleman who was a former Kyiv high-level official basically saying that his wife and daughter, he was doing them a favor by basically making them stay in the household, raise children, cook, clean, because who wants to deal with that stress of running a business or running a government? Men were actually doing women a favor. And also, someone shared some research that I did find was accurate, that something like 20 to 30% of women of a certain generation in Ukraine still felt it was appropriate to be physically reprimanded for making mistakes in the household or with raising children. And so a lot of these men thought because of the cultural difference, it was okay. And I realized, like you said, there's just some things that, in our heart of hearts, we know are not, no matter where it's happening or how long the cultural tradition goes back, that it's not right to restrict, definitely not abuse, but restrict people from being, who they are, who they want to be, and reaching their full potential.
Well, of course, if we really want to be honest about it, we still see it here. Women still are not treated equally. They don't get the same wages. The unemployment rate among employable persons with disabilities, and specifically I'll deal with blindness, is like 65%. And it's not that we can't work, it's that people think we can't work.
Right.
And so the cultural differences are not necessarily as great as we would like to believe. It's pretty systemic, which is all the more reason why we need to look at changing the definition of the word.
Yeah.
And and moving forward that way. Well, you started a company, 1A create consultant. Tell me about that. Because that's what you're doing now full time, and that keeps you out of trouble.
Yeah, well, it actually was designed,
or at least it keeps you doing something. I don't know about out of trouble.
Yeah, it was actually designed to get me into trouble, I think. When I went from running the Hospice and Palliative Care Foundation to running the Social Justice or DEI organization, the latter, one of the reasons the board hired me was to help evolve, help develop a more of a change management business model at the nonprofit DEI group. They were mostly focused on community relations, outreach, youth programs, and they wanted me to come help develop some more organizational change, kind of corporate or business change type work, like strategic planning and activation, cultural assessment, leadership development. And that was something that I brought into it, thinking that I'm going to have DEI professionals doing the programmatic work, being my advisors, that I was really going to focus on infrastructure, operations, administration, resource development, board engagement. But, because of COVID and some other factors, I ended up getting much more involved in the actual delivery of DEI type education and programming. And so my skills sets started to develop and meld into what was much more around culture change than I would say just straight operational or administrative change management. And I did a little of that work on the side. I mentioned Ukraine. That was actually the impetus to starting 18 Create. My tax attorney, to be honest with you, said, Donald, that I highly recommend spending the money on starting the LLC for tax benefits. It'll just help you and your family by starting this. And so I started it in 2019 with just the idea that maybe once or twice a year I would do some work on the side outside of my full-time job as a nonprofit CEO. And then COVID happens. The world goes predominantly, if not all, virtual. My organization that I was running had to adapt. And so I started to become more proficient in doing virtual work. And then because word spread and opportunities presented themselves, otherwise wouldn't have been in a predominantly non-virtual world, people started reaching out for me to do some work outside of Arkansas, and it picked up a little bit more. And then, after careful consideration and talking about it with my family, I thought, I think I can do this full time. And being a white, hetero, cis male, running a social justice DEI organization, I really, ever since day one of the job, I was ready to step down. I was trying to model being an ally, being a co-conspirator in dismantling systems of oppression. And the nonprofit world still is way too predominantly led by white people, particularly, white males, white cis female and males. And so I wanted to step down anyway. And the goal was to step down by the end of 2023. But because the world went virtual and opportunities had picked up, I decided that I would take a chance and start my own business. And I got some subcontract folks that I trusted and were brilliant, much, much better and smarter than me. That was the best advice my dad ever gave me, was just, if I ever become a leader, just surround myself with people more talented and smarter than me. So that hadn't been a problem. And I did that and went full time at beginning of 2022. So here I am now.
So what do you think has been kind of the most significant thing you've learned, and what do you think has been the most maybe profound way you've affected the whole concept of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and just in all of what you do?
I would say probably just right off the top of my head, the thing that has been the most significant thing I've learned from doing this work that applies to being more effective at this work is really, really trying to understand your clients, or I say partners, your partner's situation, an organization's current culture, the context, doing your best to try to form a level of relationship and trust with them before doing any sort of quote unquote work with them. And I came into doing this work where the organization that I took over in Arkansas was in year 55 or 56 when I took it over. So we had a pretty decent stable of organizations we worked with, and through word of mouth, we gained more organizations. And it would literally be, this is what we offer. They choose. We come in and do the work. And I realized how critically important some level of audit or assessment or genuine understanding of their situation around DEI, what their hopes are, what their expectations are, what have they done in the past, where their leadership's heads and hearts are at, where the non-supervisory role folks' heads and hearts are at, and putting myself out there and my staff's out there in terms of humility and vulnerability and modeling what inclusion in action or equity and diversity in action looks like, how important that is before just coming in and really just being a teaching figure. And I think that's been probably the most critical thing. And that's not always easy to do. Some folks don't have the time or the will to allow that or to do that. But I would say that some of the most, or probably the most effective impact that I've had on organizations are with folks that either I've already have a relationship with, and so the walls are already dropped, and we can really get at the heart of what can and needs to be done, or folks that leadership or organizations who are already have a solid level of humility and vulnerability and come into it thinking, we need the help. What do we need? What do you need from us? What do we need to do to make this work? And we'll start off with some sort of assessment or audit or to better understand and to build a relation. That too is critical, not to be that group that comes in and saying, okay, we're going to teach you all how to advance DEI, but instead build relationship with our clients or our partners first. And so when we do an assessment or an audit or anything like that, there's a lot of just one-on-one group interactions, us even sometimes, if we're able to, depending on the facility and the access to, just break bread with folks before we start talking or teaching anything about diversity, equity, and inclusion, just to build trust and relationship with them first before we start doing any sort of actual programming.
If you were to give your younger self, I'm going to expand this a little bit and say, or people today, 2 or 3 pieces of advice, what would they be?
To my younger self, the first thing that comes to mind, I would say, get over yourself. Although I because of particularly my parents and a few others around me, I think had maybe more of a community-minded or servant sort of approach to life at a younger age than maybe some. But I still, though, was so absolutely consumed with myself and my success, titles, accolades, awards, and not nearly where I needed to be in terms of being a really, I think, a decent person and being inclusive and equitable. And I held so much power and privilege. I really did, just so much power, unofficially and officially throughout my schooling years and into my early professional career. So that would be one, is really focus on the vulnerability, humility aspect of just being a human being, let alone being a leader. Probably another thing that I would say to my really younger self, and this might sound very specific, but I really think there's so much at the heart of the impact this has, is to fight against bullying in schools. I've done a lot of anti-bullying work in the past few years, and at the 4th and 5th grade level, sometimes up into the middle school levels. And there's so much to unpack in why bullying happens. And you know, in the work that I do, we always say not to call the person the bully. It's the person who bullies, the person who is bullied, because I do not think the person who bullies is the enemy. They're 99.9% of the time, there's something happening in that person's life that is causing or leading to the bullying to happen. It's, you know, it's a healing mechanism for them, or it's a power issue, or it's what have you. But I just feel like at such a young age, we are, you know, discrimination and oppression, even hate, is manifesting itself in schools and other youth organizations in the form of bullying that a lot of times we think is innocent. And now with the digital world, it's pretty pervasive. And someone who has a daughter who's a senior in college now, you know, from her really understands how much pressure and what kind of unintentional most of the time, I would say, but they're still intentional, just discrimination and hatred happening that really, especially in that young age, up to 6, 7, 8 years old, when the brain is developing so significantly, so fast, that bullying has such an impact on. So I really, if I could, my much younger self, I would really tell myself to really be an advocate or a champion for anti-bullying.
What kind of advice do you have for people in the world today, based on what we've talked about for almost the last hour?
You know, going back to the humility and vulnerability thing, I think so much that causes structural discrimination or systemic oppression, or just the negative issues that seem so intractable or so daunting to people. I think a lot of times it just starts with us focusing on ourselves and just being humble enough to realize that I have a relationship or a role in this situation, this issue, even if I don't think I'm an overt racist or sexist or someone that ableist to something, but I do likely, and just to be humble enough to say, what if I do? So, and being open enough to learning more about issues that impact others, that likely impact you, and you don't even know it, and being vulnerable enough to model what it looks like to be open to learning about these other issues, and to stepping up and even if you're going to fail. A lot of people are just so scared about if I say the wrong thing, if I do the wrong thing. But I truly believe, especially if you're in genuine relationship with people, they will forgive, and there will be grace if they know that is a genuine attempt to be better, to be an ally or be a co-conspirator in justice and equity and inclusion. So really getting over that fear of failing, of hurting other people, and being humble and vulnerable, and also just to have hope. I do believe that systemic issues, pervasive issues like ableism and racism and sexism and so many others can be dismantled, and these were human created issues. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like there are human centric solutions to addressing them. And I know for so many people, especially, I think, well, not especially, probably of all ages, but I'm thinking about my daughter who's 21 and her generation. She's grown up with just a constant barrage in the media of the world's on fire, and the world's at war, and there's not a lot of, at least from my experience with her and some other folks her age, you know, it's, although they're very civic minded, hope is hard to come by it, and believe that these things can change, like the climate issue. And I feel like we have to have hope. We have to believe that we are capable of reversing and co-creating new systems that aren't oppressive, that do welcome and create equal opportunity for all people. So I would say hope is critical to have hope.
No question. And I think that the opportunities are there we, like climate change, we're told what we need to do. It's just
Exactly.
a matter of being willing to do it. I haven't asked you, why did you call the company 18 Create Consulting?
Yeah, I thought a lot about the name, and then I know it would probably been easier just to use my initials or something like that. But I really wanted the name to represent the values and principles and what we were about. So one, represents the fact that we all have individual agency and power and have a responsibility for creating change. The 8 was the 8 is actually, horizontally is the infinity symbol and represents abundance. And I think going back to that idea of lack of hope, I think a lot of people have a scarcity mindset. And I really think we need to have a mindset of abundance and that there's plenty for everybody here. And so that's what the 8 represents. And then the CREATE is an acronym. The C stands for change. The R stands for readiness. E stands for explanation. A stands for accountability. T is truth telling. And E is empathy, which are kind of the core values that guide the work that we do. And you can go to our website at 18create.com to read a little bit more about the meaning behind those letters. But yeah, so that's where 18 Create comes from.
Have you written any books or anything that talk about your experiences or any of those kinds of things?
I have not written any books or anything like
there's
that.
a goal.
I'm so envious of people that are able to do that. I honestly, I really believe I do not have the attention span to sit down. It would take me quite a while. I was a creative writing minor in college. I love to write short stories or creative nonfiction. I wrote for my school paper, and I've written a lot. I've written quite a bit in terms of materials and content but no published books. It would maybe a book of short essays or stories someday.
Well, something to work toward or collaborate with someone. Well, if people want to reach out to you and learn more about what you do and maybe seek to use your assistance and so on, what's the ways that they should do that?
Yeah, the easiest way is to visit the website. As I said, you can not only connect with me, but my awesome, amazing team of co-conspirators. So that's just 18 spelled out, create. So 18create.com. And there's a way to contact me there. And that's probably the easiest way. And you can also, via the website, you can access LinkedIn, which also you can contact me there and learn a little bit more about the work that we do.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to be here and talk with us. I think it's been very insightful and certainly very enjoyable and inspiring. But I think also you've given us a lot to think about, which is always as good as it gets, as far as I'm concerned, on this podcast on Unstoppable Mindset. So thank you for that. I hope everyone listening agrees. Please give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to our podcast, Unstoppable Mindset. And of course, especially if you happen to be on iTunes, go give us a rating. We appreciate that. A 5-star rating would be appreciated. If you'd like to reach out to me and suggest any guests, and Donald, to you as well, please don't hesitate to email michaelhi@accessibe.com or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast. So we definitely want to hear from you. We want your thoughts. And again, we sure would appreciate good ratings and suggestions for more guests. And Donald, one more time, thanks very much for being here and being with us today.
Thank you, Michael. It was an honor. And yeah, you are a true hero and titan, I think, in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's been a pleasure to learn more about you and get to know you. And I definitely hope that I get to work with you in the future.